delighted to welcome all of you here today for part of our scholarly communication series. There are a large number of people here, Laurel, today who are from other universities within the consortium.
Great.
And we're delighted to have that, as well as our AU colleagues attending us today. Our speaker today is Laurel Hack, who is the Executive Director of ORCID, a community-based nonprofit organization dedicated to connecting research and researchers by providing a registry of unique and persistent personal identifiers. Those things our parents thought they gave us a long time ago turned out not to be true. Dr. Hack earned a BS and a master's in biology at Stanford University, then completed her PhD in neuroscience, also at Stanford University Medical School, and conducted postdoctoral research at NIH. Following her postdoctoral work, she served as the editor of Science Magazine's Next Wave Postdoc Network. She has been a program officer for the Committee on Science, Engineering, and Public Policy at the National Academies, where she directed workforce policy studies on international students, interdisciplinary research, women faculty, postdoc researchers, and innovation policy. She has also served as the Chief Science Officer at Discovery Logic, a Thomson Reuters business where she provided research policy expertise and managed development of research evaluation systems. And from all of that, she came to understand that we do in fact need persistent identifiers.
Yes.
Welcome to AU.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So I have something like 38 slides, which is probably too many. And so I want to encourage you, if you have a question, just raise your hand. And if I don't use all the slides, it's really okay. All right, just ask. Can you hear me back there? I think we got everything set up. All right, so I think that there's two slides. If you don't get anything else from this talk, pay attention to these two slides because it's what ORCID's all about. There's this one and there's a plumbing slide, okay? So the first one is this. I think everyone here, so everyone, how many people here do IT work? Yes. How many people library? Anybody else? Okay. So digital scholarly communications require information that's machine readable. And I know anyone who works in the library, you try to address this issue by extracting and coding and using metadata, right? And no one can ever agree on a metadata standard. So there's multiple metadata standards, and everyone gets frustrated, right? But we know it has to be machine readable. So this is number one. And so Nancy kind of took my fire here. I was going to talk a little bit about how I got here. So this is my research career, right? I spent 15 years doing basic research, lab research, and published a number of articles. And really, I think half the articles don't have the same name on them. LHack, it's LL Hack, it's Laurel Hack, it's Laurel L Hack, you know, and I have a pretty uncommon name, but because of publishing practices, I end up with different names, machine readable names on these articles, right? And so well, okay, so that's what happened here. So, but these are somewhat similar fields too, right? But not quite. And so people would look up LHack and try to figure out if the LHack who did the narcolepsy study was the same LHack who did the metabotropic glutamate receptor studies, and they're at two different organizations, so really is it the same? And then I jumped over here into policy work. Oh my God, that couldn't possibly be the same person, even if it was the same name on the paper, because the field was so radically different and the organization was different, that couldn't be the same person. So I did policy work, worked at the National Academies. Here, I was the study officer. Right? The study officer is not actually the author. The study officer is staff. And so here I was responsible for getting out the door 5 books, 4.5 books. Anyway, my name is in the book in the front matter, which is like the ghetto. There's no way that that information surfaces, right? So anyone who doesn't know me or doesn't actually look at the book and see the front matter doesn't know that I had anything to do with this stuff, even though I spent 3 hard-earned years of my life working on this, right? And then I moved over into corporate land, right? And, oh, do you publish here? Yeah, you do. But now I've got a new email address, a new affiliation, and I'm working in infrastructure and IT. Oh my God, is that really the same person? all kinds of trouble here with names, okay? And then, you know, as I was here at Discovery Logic, we ended up getting acquired by Thomson Reuters. Right about this time is when Researcher ID was launched, 2006, 2007. And not that long after, well, actually, when Researcher ID launched, I'm like, oh, this is great. There's finally some way that I can put all my information with an ID and we're all happy, right? I used to work for TR, so I tried to get this to work. I'm not actually in the Thomson Reuters office. I'm in a satellite office of Thomson Reuters, and our IP range wasn't actually included so that we could access Web of Science. So I'm trying to use Researcher ID, right? And I can't actually use it because I don't have access to Web of Science. So I had to type everything in to this, which is not handy. And even if I had access to Web of Science, if I had a book that wasn't in there, it wasn't going to show up, okay? So Researcher ID had some issues with, and it's a great thing. It has some really neat graphic stuff in it, but it had some issues for people who aren't at standard universities that don't have Web of Science subscriptions, have a hard time using these proprietary solutions, okay? At the same time as this, about Scopus and the Elsevier Scopus Author ID was also launched. So Researcher ID, the concept was the individual was the center of it. The individual had to take some action to get their ID associated, or their person associated with their ID. Scopus said, researchers are busy enough. Let's use automated disambiguation processes to try to find clusters and then assign IDs to them. Well, that didn't really work either. So anyway, we'll talk about that in a minute. What these organizations found, Thomson Reuters, Elsevier, the major publishers who all have these disastrous author databases with multiple records in them for the same person, or are they the same person? The funders who are trying to do evaluation studies and spend piles of money trying to figure out, are these the same people? The universities who are trying to figure out who's the expert here. In the US, maybe not so much as in Europe, doing the evaluation in the university to justify the block grant funding that might provide you with millions of dollars a year. Who are my people and how can I tell you what they did? It's a mess. Okay, so all of these different organizations got together and said, we cannot solve this problem on our own. There is a huge problem with names for people. We can't solve it in a silo, in a corporate solution. We can't solve it just throwing people at it. It's just a mess. And so out of all of that, in about 2007, was the first meeting of people saying, okay, we acknowledge this is a problem, first step of your 12-step problem, right? And then about 2009, this group of people, actually a very large group of people, decided, okay, we're going to do something about it. And they formed, I guess, the first working group of something called ORCID. In 2010, ORCID was actually incorporated as a nonprofit organization. And I put 2012 down because that's when we launched the registry. Okay, and I've been on board since 2012. So this really grew out of a community need. It's not something we're trying to stick onto the community. It's something the community asked for and developed, and it's got very broad participation across all community sectors. So this is ORCID. We've talked about name problems. So what I'm trying to convince you of here is that algorithms are not enough. Individuals are not enough. We have to bring these pieces together. And we have issues with people like Ted who have issues like me. Laurel Hack, Ella Hack, he has Ted and Edward, so he has also different first initials. You have the Jens Age Schmerup Sorensens of the world, who also have special characters and multiple family names. So he's got something like 50 different versions of his name floating around out there. And who wants to set up that kind of search string, right? You've got Julie Banfield, who got married and decided to change her last name. And then you have transliteration. So this is a problem for Asian names. It's also a serious problem for Arabic names, transliteration. And you also have, in Chinese, you have which one is the first and the last name. And in Arabic, you're not quite sure which one is the first name many times. So all kinds of different reasons that we have issues with names where names become not machine readable. Okay? And I have this, which I should probably use, right? All right, so what we do at ORCID is we provide that persistent digital identifier, but not just that, because just building a registry is not enough. Just building a ballpark isn't enough. You have to build the roads that get there. You have to put the seats in the ballpark. So what we do is work with libraries, with the IT sections at universities, with the research office, but also with the research funders, the publishers, the repositories, everybody, so that these identifiers are actually collected during key workflows. Whenever someone enters a name, this identifier will come along. Okay, so it's not a post hoc solution. It's supposed to be an as something becomes public solution, so that there is a provenanced way, an authenticated way of linking a person and their name with an object in a research workflow. And doing that, it also means there's very little, if any, added time for the researcher. Okay? So automated linkages. And we focused on professional activities, okay? We are not Facebook. We don't care what you did over the weekend unless it was a professional talk, okay? So, so here's the registry. I did a little search last night, and this is how I show up when you search the registry. For me, you can see my ID, my first name, my last name, and my list of other names. And this is my other name in Latvian. So you can see we do accept other characters. You can type your name in any character set that you can put in a computer. Machine readable, okay? But all of these names are linked to this ID, okay? It's a free registry. Anyone can come register for an ID. We don't have anything that says you must define yourself as a researcher. If you feel you need this ID, come and get one. It's community-led, so we have a board. I actually am just coming off of a board meeting, so I apologize for the dark circles under the eyes. I'm a little wiped out today. We do have a board. The board is elected from our membership, and we do have a number of steering groups so that anyone is welcome to participate in. We also have a number of ways for the community to feed into what we're doing. So if you have an idea or a suggestion, we do have an ideas board, and we do pay attention to it. Last fall, we actually released 7 major releases that handled, I think, the top 20 different things that people have been asking us to do over the past year. So we do really pay attention to that. Our data are open. The software, it's not really our data, the data that are in the registry that the individual marks public are open. They're available through the public API, and they're also available through a once-a-year data dump that we put out. So every October, we put out a new file. We have open software. We have a GitHub repository. We have open APIs. We have an open sandbox for people to play around with all those APIs, and we have documentation. The next question is, how the heck are we supported? We do have open APIs, but we also have a member API. And we do also have very strict privacy policy, because this is it's a researcher thing. The researchers have to understand that they control their destiny here, okay? So only the data that the researcher makes public is public. So the researcher can make things public, they can make them private, which no one can see, or they can make them what's called limited access, kind of in between. This API, the member API, with permission from the individual, can read limited access data. And the member API also allows members to post information or update information in ORCID records, okay? So we are supported through member fees, and member fees from organizations much like yours. So that's how we are supported. So we're more than a registry, right? So we don't just have the IDs, we also have these links. This person's in Saudi Arabia, this is websites. And what's kind of cool here, I think, is KAUST just integrated with ORCID. And they've created, and I'll show you some screens later, a way for individuals to link their ORCID ID with the university. And in doing that, then what KAUST did was actually post into the individual's record their affiliation. So libraries in the room, source, KAUST repository, created, date. There's all kinds of provenance information on this record, okay? If an individual wrote this in, it would say source and then that individual's name, okay? So what we're really looking at here is how do we create this ID, which was obviously created by this person, right? But how do we create these links that have the provenance on them that help you understand and trust the information in this record? So I would encourage all of you to think about this kind of workflow. It's not just beneficial to your university, it's beneficial to how we use and understand this information in the community. All right, and I do want to stress here, while we are more than a registry, we are not a profile system. ResearchGate is a profile system. We are not a profile system. We are also not a repository. We do not hold the papers. Sorry, I got to turn this off. Why did that happen there? Okay, we hold pointers to the paper. So ORCID is about, here's an ID, here's another ID. How do we create a provenance link between them? Questions? This is a second slide. We need machine-readable data. ORCID is plumbing, plumbing, plumbing. Remember this, okay? This is really important because if you don't think about ORCID like plumbing, you don't get what we do. And you'll be unhappy. We're not a profile system. So here's what this looks like. So with other identifiers, so here's ORCID. I know ORCID's not at the center of the universe, but it's at the center of mine. So in the middle, we have ORCID, IDs for people, right? Where we link to funding. We link to higher education through this ISNI identifier, Ringgold ID for the organizations. We link to information at professional associations through their member ID, through the abstract ID when someone submits a paper. We link to other person identifiers. We are not in competition with Scopus. We are not in competition with Researcher ID. We are in collaboration with them. They have actually built search and link wizards that allow an individual to push and pull data between ORCID and them. Okay? We work with publishers and link to things like DOIs and ISBNs, and also repositories. There's actually a number of universities that are starting to require graduate students to include their ORCID ID when they submit their final thesis, which is kind of cool. So now you have a person, you have their organizational affiliation, and you have the DOI for their thesis, provenance three-way link that's available publicly. I think it's pretty darn cool. So anyway, so works, organizations, and person IDs. That's what ORCID's all about, okay? So I thought I'd go off on the side a little bit and talk about what this looks like if we think about persistent identifiers broadly. So here's a research paper. Somebody submits their manuscript. The manuscript is accepted and then it's published. Very simplistic view, but this is the way a lot of people think about publishing a paper. So where do identifiers fit into this? All over the place, right? So we have ORCID up here, right? Here's your ID for a person, but there's also now talk about identifiers for a type of contributor. Were you the author? Were you the person who developed the data set? Talking about IDs for the data set. IDs for the organization. Where did you do the research? Where were you employed? What facility or equipment did you use? IDs for the funder and IDs for the grants. As well as the research, I took that one out. There could also be here something for resources. What antibody did you use, right? To get back to this question of how do we repeat all of this? How can we find the person who did it? How can we find the resources they used to do it? And where the heck is the data anyway, right? All of these are in conversation right now in the community about how do we attach this information to a paper. So this is in the manuscript submission section, right? Now you move over here to acceptance, and there's a whole review thing that happens right here. Well, why shouldn't we acknowledge the reviewers? So a number of publishers are now starting to ask for ORCID IDs for the reviewers and to link and acknowledge their activity, right? Even if it's double blind. How do we acknowledge somebody spent a lot of time helping us work on quality control? Manuscript is accepted. In many cases, co-author information is collected here. I personally think it should be here, but a lot of times it's here. You can attach your ORCID ID at this time to the co-author. And also make sure these people are actually the co-authors. What's been fun or interesting about ORCID is people have gone in and used their search and link wizards to find their papers, and they're like, I don't didn't remember authoring this paper. I've never seen this before, but it's in my field, and that is me. So they find, a number of people will find papers where they were guest authors, not badly, but because they may have contributed an antibody or some kind of reagent, and the person, the postdoc, whoever writing the paper, decided to put them on as an author, but never told them. Right? And one would say, how should they get through the entire publishing workflow without this person knowing they were on the paper? Shouldn't happen, right? And that's not fraud. That just, it happens, right? And there is fraud examples as well. So now we've got the manuscript accepted. And then at some point in here, between acceptance and publication, the metadata for that article is sent to Crossref. Everyone in here knows what Crossref is? Anyone not know what Crossref is? It's okay. It's okay. That's good. So Crossref is a very large repository, but mainly what it does is issues DOIs, so digital object identifiers, persistent IDs for papers. So they work with publishers. When publishers finalize a paper, most publishers are members of Crossref, and they will request a DOI for the paper. When that paper is somewhere between acceptance and published, the metadata for the paper will be submitted to Crossref. So Crossref actually has a storage repository of all of the papers that have ever been issued a DOI. It's pretty cool. So now what's happening, I keep pressing the wrong button, sorry. What's happening is that all of these IDs, right, are starting to move over into Crossref, right? It's not the paper. It's the ID. And what Crossref does, in addition to issuing the ID, is they also make sure that it's a persistent identifier. So they do a lot of work to make sure the paper doesn't disappear off the face of the earth because it's in digital ether space somewhere. And they also have something called Crossmark, which allows them, if a paper changes metadata, right, they actually will manage those updates and make sure that whoever's searching for the paper finds the most recent version. It's a pretty neat service. Why I bring it up is because as this metadata goes to Crossref, it includes the ORCID ID. Okay, this isn't happening for all publishers yet, but it is increasingly happening. Many, many publishers are doing this part. Some are doing this, and some are doing this. What we're trying to do is get all of the publishers to do this. Okay, now we have the published article, right? And what we're working on with Crossref and the publishers right now is that when that article is published, the metadata from the publication comes back and updates the ORCID record. So that all the individual has to do is use their ORCID ID when they submit the paper. And then, poof, the ORCID record's updated, and then you can use our APIs to update your systems. Okay? We'll talk about that in a bit more detail. Any questions? I've got these eyebrows up there. I'm like, questions? So I'll show you how this looks. So this is an example of two different journals that are publishing ORCID identifiers in the paper, which also means that they're sending them to Crossref. So here you've got the ORCID ID for the first author, and you've also got the DOI for the article over here. This is the Journal of Korean Medical Science. Korea probably has the worst name problem of any country, with something like 50% of the population sharing 3 last names. So it is not uncommon in a Korean journal to have 2 people with exactly the same name as authors. Yeah, so they've started, this journal has basically said, use your ORCID ID, period, if you want to publish here. So they publish in the paper all of the IDs. Here's the person's name, and here's the actionable link, resolvable link that'll take you back to their ORCID record. Other journals like Nature are publishing, when they publish the paper, so here you can see the list of names. You can click on the name and it'll take you to the Nature author record for that person, and within that record the ORCID ID link is. Okay, so different ways that publishers are doing this, but many, many, many publishers are collecting the IDs. Oh, I keep forgetting I have this. So, and it's not just publishers, it's also that search engines are incorporating the IDs when they index. So you've got Scopus, which allows, here, I told you your publications on Scopus may be spread over a number of different author profiles, very true. This is from the Scopus page, this is why I always like to do this. because they're generated automatically. In order to create a single profile containing the correct publications, they have a wizard that allows you to connect your ORCID record and your ID with your Scopus author ID, people and algorithms, right? And the fun thing about this is it doesn't just allow you to connect, it allows you to push your ID onto your existing publications, okay? And it allows you to push the metadata for those publications into your ORCID record. So from an individual's perspective, you've now just cleaned up the way that you are represented in Scopus. So when someone searches for you, they find the right stuff. And you've been able to then post all that information to your ORCID record so you don't have to type it in. No one wants to type this stuff in. So now you know there's metadata. From a library's perspective, metadata is consistent. Same thing with Researcher ID and ORCID. If you've gone to a lot of work and have listed all of your information in Researcher ID, you can push and pull information between these two systems. And post your ID so it's now available in Web of Science to inform Web of Science searches. And I mentioned the Crossref already. All right, all of these databases allow you to search using an ORCID ID, and there are other ones. Yes?
Can you just talk a little bit about the financial contribution at each point? So for example, the Crossref, I think where I get real confused about is who's paying for the DOIs, who's asking for the DOIs? Is it the publisher? Is it?
It's not us. We don't. So Crossref, we're a member of Crossref, and Crossref's a member of us.
Right.
We don't issue DOIs.
Right.
We just link to them, right? So how this works for Crossref is the publishers pay per DOI for them to issue a DOI for the paper, okay? And I don't know what the pricing scheme is, okay? What Scopus is a member, sorry, Elsevier is a member of ORCID, Thomson Reuters is a member of ORCID, Crossref is a member of ORCID. They all use the member API, and they have created these wizards, not us. They have done it, okay? So it's really important. This isn't just us going out there and creating wizards all over the place. It's really a collaboration with the community to create these wizards because they involve authentication. And the authentication step has to happen in the member's system, not ours, right? We could create a pile of wizards, but then we wouldn't be able to push the ID into their system. So that's the important part here, or one of the important parts. All right, anything else? All right. So here's another example. Texas A&M was part of a pilot project we did funded by the Sloan Foundation. They were one of 7 universities and 2 associations that got a small grant from us, actually through Sloan, to do a pilot project. And what they did was they decided, you know what, all graduate students should have an ORCID ID and use it when they submit their thesis. And then we, Texas A&M, can update their record with this information. At the same time, they've also updated personnel records. So I don't know, I realize this isn't really have the greatest resolution. But so here we have James Creel's ID in ORCID. We also have James Creel's personnel record. And you can see if we come down here that his ORCID record, thank you, is an EduPerson, right? Is now in his personnel record at the university. And when the universities do this, any other system that connects into that personnel record now has access to that ID. And this ID can be used to do a number of different things at the university. Okay, can help support repository updates, can help support updates to the faculty information system. It can be used for Shibboleth stuff. There's all kinds of fun stuff you can do once it's in your personnel record. So that's an example from Texas A&M. Here's an association. This is Society for Neuroscience. They were also part of the same project. And what they've done is when you go to renew at Society for Neuroscience, there's a little button there that says, please, please, please link your Society for Neuroscience member record with your ORCID ID. They have the same thing over here. If you just go into your account, they ask you to link it to your account. The next step that they're going to do is when, I'm a member of SFN, so I'm really psyched about this. When you come to submit an abstract for the next meeting, they're going to be asking for your ORCID ID when you submit the abstract. I think one of the largest pain points for faculty in managing their CVs is how the heck do I get all that, the presentation information on my CV? This is really a huge part of a faculty member's life that's really, really hidden in terms of access in the internet to this kind of activity. So I'm really pleased to see organizations like Society for Neuroscience taking this up. Data sets. So how many of you know anything about Figshare? Ooh, a couple, good. So Figshare is an example of an open resource where individuals can go deposit data sets. In many cases, individuals at a university would go to the library to deposit and manage data sets. I don't have a library, so I use Figshare. But there's many ways to do this. So we have a way, what Figshare has done is allowed to sync between Figshare and ORCID, so that as somebody uploads their information into Figshare, it will also post into ORCID. You don't have to do it twice. You just have to put in one place, and now the metadata also moves over into ORCID. And I'll show you an example of how this information is being used by third-party services as well. DataCite does the same thing. When you deposit into DataCite, as part of the metadata schema, you can now include not just the contributor names, but also their IDs. Okay? And so here you have an example. This is Kyle Cranmer. This is from his ORCID record. And you can see data. Here's the DOI. Here's the URL. And this was part of the work on the Higgs boson. So it's not just the paper that he's linked to, it's also data that were presented in that paper that can now be made accessible to other people interested in messing around with the data. But then there's also data management, right? Which is an increasingly interesting question. I just saw a little post a couple days ago that said, I think the NSF is actually now going to start to pay for data management, which was, I think, pretty revolutionary. The concept here is we've got all this data floating around, and maybe not at CERN, but I know I had a bunch of data on little floppy drives back in the day when floppy drives existed. And when I left the lab, the floppy drives, I don't know where they are anymore. So what is happening now, as everyone knows, there is now data management planning, which in many cases happens in the library. You guys do so many things. It's pretty cool. So what we've been doing is trying to figure out, is there a role for contributors in this process? Kind of like review. Who writes the data management plan? It's probably not the researcher. It's probably somebody in the library. So why not give that person authorship? Why not make it a visible activity for that person? So we've been talking with folks at Purdue about a project where we can see, even if that data management plan is inside in an internal repository and not made public, that the authors of that data management plan actually get an ORCID ID so that they're trackable within the university. And when somebody comes back and wants to know more about this data, right, where is it? The data management plan and the data and the person are now linked together. Okay? And we just published a paper in PeerJ, this is with Force 11, about how to actually go out and cite data. So this was, I just got a note this morning that it was formally finally accepted. So it should be coming out in PeerJ, the first issue of their computer science magazine. And I'm happy to provide the link to that. All right, and it goes on. Grants. So Wellcome Trust was the first funder to say yes, and so they have integrated ORCID identifiers into the process of application. The NIH have integrated ORCID identifiers into the Science CV platform, which is envisioned to be a federal agency application mechanism for federal funding. And it's not just associating the ORCID ID, it's also using the APIs to pull information from a person's ORCID record to help populate that CV. Oh my gosh, I don't have to type it in anymore, right? So all of these things pull together and allow an individual to really reduce the amount of work and retyping they have to do, and from a metadata perspective, ensure that the metadata is consistent from the time something becomes either created or made public all the way through the system, right? And really relies not just on the metadata, but the IDs within that metadata, okay? So, questions? Yes?
I have a question about, and you might be going into this, so that's fine. but about implementation at, say, like a university, if you wanted to do that in a big way, not just to say, we encourage you to get these, but to try to, with the goal of getting it implemented across the university. Do you have, are there any examples of where that worked really well?
Yes. Yes. I'm on 18. That's like slide 37. I can just skip forward to that slide and show you what it looks like, but I can describe it. So what we see with universities, what seems to be working, and part of this was us learning also through this Sloan program of what works and what doesn't work. We had originally thought, well, universities could create IDs for everybody and then encourage their researchers to come claim them, right? So it would be create, pre-populate, come claim. They'll claim because, oh, this ID is now linked to all my stuff, right? Doesn't work very well because, as you know, researchers may or may not decide to come engage in any process. And so what we found works a whole lot better is for the university to create a landing page, okay? That has, so it's university branded, the person trusts it, right? And it has information on it, basically a button for one person to click here if you want an ORCID ID. It'll take them to a sign-in page. If they already have an ID, they can sign in. If they don't, they can register. And then in that same process, grant the university permission to write information into the record. The cool thing about this is that not only is it easy and branded from the university's perspective, it can also be inserted or pointed to from any number of different processes at the university. So a new person comes onto faculty, send them to this page, right? Part of your onboarding process. Somebody leaves, part of offboarding. It's part of how somebody submits a thesis. It's part of how somebody updates their local Vivo instance, whatever. So that's what we found really, really works. And we have some more detailed documentation that I'd be happy to point you to. And I have an example of a screen coming up. But all of these things, because ORCID is community-driven, because it is really researcher-focused, there has to be outreach involved. The person has to use their ID, otherwise none of this works. And so I think that's where trying to create the IDs and claim after the fact didn't work because a lot of universities just didn't really understand the amount of outreach that's needed. So anyway, so we are interdisciplinary, we're international, and we work on communications for all researchers, so not just publications. This is a map of usage. Oh, this is still Gulf Coast, sorry. And so you can see there's a lot of usage, as you would expect based on, well, mostly as you expect based on where you would see people publishing papers or engaged in research. You can see China's pretty high, India, also the US. The registry is available in 9 languages, which is always entertaining. And we do have a fair amount of usage here in the UK, and maybe as you would expect, but maybe higher than you would expect in the Iberian Peninsula. And that's because there are now consortia in Spain, so groups of universities that are working together to promote ORCID, as well as in Portugal, where the national funder has just said, you know what, if you want funding from us, you have to have an ID. We're done. And there are other funders. There's a couple funders in the US doing that. There are also funders up in Scandinavia and other regions of the world that are starting to require the use of ORCID IDs for the granting process. Okay. So how are we doing? So we launched in October of 2012. Just about at the 2-year mark, we hit 1 million identifiers that had been issued. The reason there's colors on here, the lighter blue color, I hope this works for colorblind people, the lighter blue color on the bottom are those individuals who registered for an ORCID ID during one of these connection points. Okay, so they saw it because their funder asked them for it. They saw it because their university asked them for it. They saw it because the publisher's asking for it. Okay, this shows you kind of the level of integration we have in the community. This blue bar, people who came directly to the website, and the orange bar are universities creating. All right, how does it work? I mentioned this already. It allows researchers to connect. Well, it allows them to get their ID, to connect to their existing works, because a lot of people have existing works they want to clean up the record. And members build these integrations. And I cannot stress enough that it's the members that build the integrations. We help them build them, but the members have to build them. And the point is then every new work, every new affiliation will be connected back to ORCID through one of these integration points. All right. But we also have this fun, right? What motivates the researcher? Right? This is what motivates the researcher. They really could care less about identifiers. They could care less, I'm speaking as a researcher, they could care less about the research infrastructure. None of this do they care about. So for all of this grand vision to be realized, we have got to engage the researcher where they care about it. Okay? So that's why we have to think about these identifiers and research infrastructure at the points where researchers engage. Where they publish is a big one. Where they ask for funding is a big one. Where they work is a big one. So if we can find really, really, really easy ways to integrate this collection of an ID and connection, this will happen. Okay? But this cannot be a big ask. All right, so we've been trying. It takes 30 seconds to register, and that's not just me. As long as you have a decent internet connection, and maybe that you aren't in mainland China, like me, it takes 30 seconds to register. It's free. The individual owns the record and controls the privacy settings, and it works on multiple interfaces, laptops, phones, tablets. It works. 30 seconds. So the other nice thing about this, and we're not asking you for your date of birth, we're not asking for your phone number, we're just asking for your name and a password. Sorry, name, email, and a password. Because it's so quick to register, it's also really easy to put into other workflows. So if a publisher decides to integrate this, it adds 30 seconds to the manuscript submission process. That's it. So the publishers are willing to engage, etc. There are tools inside of ORCID that allow you to connect your identifier, your record, to things like name variations, all fielded, to your affiliations, to your existing works and your existing funding. This is where people say, oh, it kind of looks like a profile system. Well, it looks like this because people want to have ways to link to their existing stuff. This is not mandatory. This is really for people, if they want to do this, they can do this. What we do try to encourage researchers to do is say, please register and do one more thing. I don't care what the one more thing is, but do one more thing. Because, as you saw, the registration form is very sparse. If somebody just registers, it's hard to see how different their record is from another. But many people are registering when they're publishing a manuscript. And the idea is that manuscript, if it's accepted, will come back and update their record. But we say, you know what? Why don't you put your name variations in there? Take another 30 seconds. Take another 30 seconds and link to where you're currently working. So you've now got a minute or a minute and a half, you're done. You've made a pretty distinguishable record. You can move on. These are the existing works search and link wizards. Again, these are all created by outside organizations that are members of ORCID. We have one that allows people to link to Chinese language journals, to data in Australia, to Crossref, to data at DataSite. So anyone who has a data set that is a DOI, this will work. Europe PubMed Central, which also includes grants information. ISNI to ORCID. If you have an ISNI identifier, you can link to it this way and also pull in book information if you have ISBNs associated with your ISNI ID. To Researcher ID and to Scopus. And these are the ones that are in our interface. There's other ones like Modern Language Association that aren't going to be in our interface, that will be on their side. So their members who have access can then link their modern MLA record with their ORCID ID and push information, metadata, back into their ORCID record. Okay, so we're not just science. We do many languages and many types of research. You can link to awarded projects. So this is a search and link wizard that we've worked on with a company called Uber Research, and they created Uber Wizard. So if you have grants that are in their large repository of grants, you can then say, yep, those are mine, and push that metadata to your ORCID record. Again, the idea is, can we find sources of information where a person can find most of their stuff and easily link their existing stuff to their record? In the future, we hope that this isn't so necessary, that as people use their ID, these different organizations are going to push the metadata back to the record. So it's really just using the ID, not searching anymore. As you can see, again, metadata, you have the title of the grant, the dates as expressed in the database, the grant number, and the source. So metadata, metadata, metadata. You can also link to an organization. There's a type ahead list. We use Ringgold identifiers. And every new member that comes on board makes sure that how they're represented in Ringgold is agreeable to them. Part of bringing you on board as a member of ORCID is also making sure we have your Ringgold ID properly specified in our database, so that when you post information to a record, that provenance information is correct. This is just as much of a mess as people's names. It may be more. And so we have no desire to manage this database. We just want to use a resource. I should mention, we do use Ringgold here. And we use Fundref here. We are working very hard to get Ringgold and Fundref to talk to each other, because I don't want to have to use two different databases for organization IDs. And the good news is that they're talking to each other. So it's actually Elsevier, Ringgold, and Fundref or Crossref are talking to each other to make sure that these databases of organizations cross-link. All right? All right, so this is how I see the ORCID responsibility. We create tools. We engage the community. We make sure that best practices are applied, actually tell you what they are, to your point. And then we work with the community to make sure this whole piece, the whole auto-update piece is embedded, it happens. So how are we doing? We have, this is out of date already, we have 200 members across the research spectrum. You can see most of our members are research institutes. And 100 live integrations in every region of the world and in every sector of the research community. So in 2 years. I'm pretty happy with this. We have more to do. I'm sorry, I should have updated this one. Arabic speaking, I just gave a talk. We used some of the slides, I'm sorry. And we do actually have some movement in Arabic speaking countries, which I'm actually really, really happy about as well. National approaches, a number of countries are starting to work on or have already embarked upon a national approach to ORCID, or at least smaller consortium-based approaches within the country. In Austria and Portugal and Sweden, their national funders have come out with a requirement for ORCID. You can see the requirement says 2016 because it takes funders a long time to get their systems tested and everything for the funding call. But they've put out the requirement. In Denmark, 7 of the 8 universities got together as a consortium and are working on a joint approach to ORCID. I mentioned Portugal already. Every single person there, 14,000 people, registered for ORCID in 3 weeks, and also synced their ORCID record with their Scopus record. So they have a really good head start on managing kind of their new big national CV system. Sweden came out with a national recommendation in 2013, the UK in 2012, and the UK, there's an organization called JISC, which just came out saying, you know, I think we're going to go with a national consortium approach, which I'm really excited about. So there's a lot of movement that way. There's also movement in Australia, potentially with a national approach, as well as New Zealand. All right, and we have a new group membership policy, so if you guys have groups and you want to go this way, I'm happy to talk about that. Coming in 2015. So this is where we're trying to get to. The author, here's the author. They register for an ID. They go to publish or submit a data set, and form fields can be pre-populated from the ORCID record. Clearly, this requires action on the part of the researcher and the publisher, but this can happen, it is happening. Single sign-on is also happening here as well. The authenticated ID becomes part of the paper or the data set. Then, upon publication, the ID is indexed. The ID gets out there, and it then flows through back to ORCID, and any system that links into ORCID through the APIs can receive updates when this information flows through. So it's a lot less librarians running after researchers, what have you done? And it's a lot more, oh, cool data, let's see what we can do with this. It's actually now 185,000 articles in Crossref include an ORCID ID. They'll start to flow into the registry before the end of the year, so that researchers who use the ID will no longer need to manually update the record in ORCID or any linked system. This is a big selling point to the researchers. It's a big selling point to you guys too, because I know you hate running after researchers. Okay, where are we with libraries? What can libraries do? Libraries can be the interface with the researcher. This is your role, right? So you can explain the importance of digital information, which I know you do. You can provide some information on ORCID. I brought these little cards. There's a sticker. It's a reusable sticker. It's got a postcard, so it says some stuff on ORCID. I'm happy to send you guys some of this. We have one-pagers. We have bookmarks available on our website. You can download. Just let me know, whatever you need. I'll show you some examples of what libraries are doing with this. You can train researchers. It doesn't take very long. Here, register. Great, you're done. And work with your organization to embed these identifiers in systems. So what does this look like? Texas A&M put together a care and feeding manual for graduate students. How do you establish your professional identity with ORCID, right? We've got this really great library guide that University College Dublin put together. There's videos. People have set up office hours, training sessions. So this is slide 35. So coming back to what does this look like? So this is KAUST. And what they did, this is their page, right? So there's a link that they send out from the vice provost. Hey guys, we think this is important. We want you to register. Click here. Takes them to this page. It's a KAUST page, not an ORCID page. It's a KAUST page. And they pre-populate this ORCID, the email field, right? So all the person has to do is say, yeah, it's okay to read information from my record. You can add the KAUST affiliation to my record. These are actually all pre-checked. And you could add publications. And this person just has to click on the Connect to ORCID button. It's all they have to do. Well, they have to click the link in their email, and they have to click that button. It takes them to the sign-in or registration page. 30 seconds later, they have an ID, and that ID is a link to KAUST, and KAUST has posted in affiliation information, and KAUST has posted in publication information. Ta-doom. They've told me this whole process takes 3 minutes. And they're done. What KAUST has also done, this is an example of their library guide. They have library training about ORCID. They have information about ORCID. They have people who know about ORCID contact us, all set up in one page. Really easy. Okay? This is what the library can do. This is what universities can do. That didn't work. Okay, yes. I was so thrilled when I saw this. They've done everything. They did click and create. They put together the library guide, and they had training sessions. That's everything. And then the next thing that they're working on is getting the research office more involved and using this information for evaluation purposes. So here's our outreach support. Here's an example of the top half of a bookmark in Chinese. They're also available in English. And we have an events page where we list, pardon me, webinars. We are striving to have monthly webinars on things of interest to the community. We just had one last week, I guess, on the metadata round trip. Everything we do, the slides are always posted and we always record it. So we also have webinars on library guides. We have a webinar on what the funders are doing, so you can go back, look at our calendar, and just click on a link and see anything. You can hear it or see it. We do have a meeting coming up For anyone who wants to go to Barcelona in May, we have, we have an outreach meeting that's going to be primarily focused on evaluation and social sciences and humanities. We have another meeting coming up, so we have 2 a year, big ones, in November in San Francisco. Oh, who would want to be there in November? And that one is really going to be focused on, I'd like to focus it on third parties, so kind of entrepreneurial use of ORCID data and ORCID IDs. And I think, right, that's where it ends. So thank you. I did want to show you one more thing as an example of what third parties are doing, and I know it's close to the end here. But I wanted to show you, so this is an example of Figshare. So I showed you, you can link your ORCID ID to your Figshare record, and then you can click a button here, very simple, that says Sync with ORCID. Okay, I won't go through it now because I'm running out of time. But here's an example of another system. This is called Impact Story, and this is another researcher-focused system that allows you to connect your ID to your profile, Impact Story. And you can also sync Figshare with your Impact Story record. And what this lets you do, and all these things come together, right? And what they do is then, with you just creating an account, syncing with ORCID, it then pulls in the metadata for all of your publications, everything you have listed on ORCID, and it will run stats for you on who's using it, okay? How many people are downloading it? How many people are viewing it? Coming back to the researcher, who's looking at my stuff and what are they looking at, right? And I get, every week, a little note saying, hey, guess what? You know, you got another 6 views on this data set. You got another 6 citations over here, blah, blah, blah. Boom, boom, boom. The researcher, all they have to do is spend a minute to link this together. And this is something else, if this is a platform you guys want to go with, something else you can show your researchers. I think it costs researchers $5 a month. So lots of fun stuff you can do here once you start connecting all this information together. I'll end there. Thank you.
Will you take some questions? Laura, do you have time for some questions?
I do. I live right up the street, so.
I'll start with what are some of the downsides that as you were designing and put together that you've already protected against?
The question we always get, we get 2 questions, but we're in the US, the second question is irrelevant. The first question is, how do you deal with duplicates? Right, because when somebody registers, it's their name and an email address, and certainly, you know, so we do have duplicate records. Some part of those million records are duplicates. And so there's 4 ways we deal with duplicates. One is we allow people, so this was one of the first things we changed right after we launched, we allow people to link multiple email addresses with their ORCID record. It can be dead emails, just anything that they used to have used. They can log into ORCID with any one of those email addresses. And then that makes it easier if their university decides to do this create process and creates it with their university address versus their Gmail address. If they already have their Gmail, university address and their Gmail in their record, a duplicate won't be created. So that's number 1. Number 2, we push people, organizations away from the create method and more this create on demand so that an individual will say, oh yeah, I already have one of these, I'm just going to sign in, I'm not going to register. So that has reduced the number of duplicate creates. Outreach, outreach, outreach. Oh shoot, there was another way we did this. If a duplicate is actually created, we also have a process for managing that. And so we will never delete an ID unless it's spam. We get some weird uses of this, but if it's a total spam thing, we'll get rid of it. But if it's an actual legitimate person, as much as we can tell that, we will never delete that ID. If there are 2 or 3 records this person has, we will merge the records together. We will only do that if we are alerted. We don't go searching for duplicate records, okay, because then it's really hard to undo this stuff. And then we also have the next piece is, what about fraud? Well, we can't prevent people from being stupid, but we have put in place a process for dispute resolution. So if somebody finds weird stuff in a record, and so we've gotten messages, this person's name doesn't match the articles in the record, and you go contact the person, well, I got married, and you're like, okay, you know, oh, interesting. So, so we do have a way for receiving that information and managing it. That's probably the biggest one. Yeah. Yep.
I was curious curious about the ontology for the ORCID record itself.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something you publish? You know, what's the scope of the different types of metadata that are included in it?
I'll show you where it is. So if you go to Help, Knowledge Base, there's all this stuff over here. And if you want to see XML, data structures, all this stuff is listed here. The idea is ORCID is not a repository. ORCID is not a library. We care about metadata about this much. We don't care about it this much. And so what we really do is focus on that resolvable persistent identifier and then a minimal set of metadata around it for people that like to actually see what it is they're linking to, and that's why we have the display. And so it's the resolvable persistent identifier and something like title and date and source, and then a few other bits of information. There's many, many other things we could put in there, but we don't because we're not a library. And there's no way that we could reconcile information between all the different kinds of work types we have and all the pile of metadata. What we really try to get people to think about with ORCID is we have the link, it's provenanced. We have that persistent identifier that's resolvable. If you want more metadata, go back to the source and get it.
But how about the scope of the different types of links that you could have? I mean, so obviously it's things like publications and data sets, but how about courses taught? I mean, like, so do you sort of have a defined scope
of work types? Yeah, pretty much. It can go on and on. I mean, one of the big things right now is how would you actually cite software? How would you actually cite review activity? And so figuring out what that looks like, and then, okay, does that fit within our current data model? And if it doesn't, we will then go back and add a field or fields to our data model. But in most cases, when you look at works, the same basic set of metadata around the work and that source identifier tends to work across many work types. All right? Yeah?
So, from the researcher point of view then, could you maybe walk us quickly through what that would look like? Not so much in the signing up part, but in the submitting things benefit to the researcher part. For example, if you activate an ORCID account number, then if I sign up for one of these and I then want to apply for national research funding in Sweden,
right.
the people who are, when I apply for the grant, I would submit that number, then the people reviewing it would be able to just click.
No, so how this works is, and I actually don't have that picture in my slide deck, sorry. It looks like, if you go to the manuscript submission page or the grant submission page, there will be the standard stuff on there, and there'll be a little green ID circle like what Stefan has on his shirt there. It's just, it looks like that. Okay, and so it'll be on the application form, and what the individual, and there'll probably be like a one-sentence description, click here to get your ID and link it to your record.
Okay.
So you would click there. It would take you to the registration or sign-in page at ORCID. You do your registration or sign-in, and the API would ship that ID back to their system. You don't type it in. If you type it in, I don't want you typing it in.
No, thank you. So then after you do that, though,
Right.
Who sees all this wonderful information and what happens? Is it going to be people reviewing the paper, able to check your credentials? Is it the publisher? Is this something that, is going to be widely available to other scholars? Because that's part of the issue with having inconsistent names, right?
Right, right. And so that really depends on the workflow, right? So right now, what members are focusing on is the ID itself.
Okay.
Some are starting to harvest the metadata, like NIH, harvesting the metadata to post into the CV. Others, like the folks in Portugal, are actually harvesting all of the metadata from the record and posting it into their CV system and using it for evaluation purposes. So it's really kind of use case dependent and member dependent on how far they go with the information. I've heard some funders talk about, you know what, in the future, the nice future with unicorns and flowers floating everywhere, that when somebody submits a grant, they wouldn't have a biosketch, they'd include their ORCID ID, and somebody could go back and see all their stuff that way.
Okay, so to be clear then that I'm understanding this, this is primarily, at least right now, a way of streamlining the process of research and researchers within broader institutional systems. It's not something that will actually it's not something that will work more on, say, the publication level, where if I have a publication under my maiden name, my married name, and with an extra additional other scholars reading it, we'll be able to tell that it's all the same person.
We don't do the disambiguation. Okay. We don't do that. We are relying on your systems and the individual to do that through interacting with these search engines. We are not a disambiguation engine. Okay. That's what Scopus does, right? Okay. That's what a lot of these other systems do. They already do a really great job with it, and I don't see why we should have to do that again. What we're trying to do is say, how do we allow the researcher to go in and look at what, I'm picking on them, Scopus has done. And so when I did this, I had 2 Scopus IDs, right? Because I had all the researchy stuff, and then I had, ooh, she's doing policy. That couldn't possibly be the same person. And so I was able to say these are both me. They collapsed those IDs, pushed my ORCID ID onto all my existing records, right? I cleaned that up. So I don't see the use of us doing that again and creating 3 versions of an ID. It's really us allowing the researchers control over linking that information together. And then moving forward, you can publish under Sunshine Flower and Lori Hack and say, you know what, those are both me. I use the same ID for both of those.
And then other people will know that I'm saying that if they're not a member, if they're not actually an ORCID member themselves.
Exactly, because the ID is embedded in the document. It's not just sitting in ORCID. It's really about getting this ID out there. It's pointless unless it gets into the metadata everywhere.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
So what plans do you have to link? I mean, you talked about, you mentioned ISNI, and I'm part of the Program for Cooperative Cataloging Policy Committee, and so one of the things that we're looking at is ways to better link out the National Authority File and VIOF, the Virtual International Authority File, to things like this.
Yep.
And we're already talking with ISNI about how to populate and have a, I guess you could say, a complete circle of sending information back and forth, and also now making sure that we're getting the OCLC identities information in there. So what do you plan, how are you going to, I know there's always more.
Yeah.
I mean, there are different types of identifiers. I'm fully aware that the identifiers used by the authority files, the virtual international authority file and whatnot, are not necessarily article level identifiers. They're larger works level identifiers. However, a lot of researchers, they have both.
Right. So we work well with ISNI. We have OCLC on our board, so let's start off there. We all get along. It's a question of how we get along. And so we started off with ISNI and said, okay, first step is let's try to get our systems to talk to each other. So we do have this ISNI to ORCID tool that ORCID built with ISNI helping us, but it's not ISNI built. And so that means ORCID can post the ISNI in our side, but ISNI is not harvesting the ORCID into their records. And that's something that we had talked with Jennifer Gattenby about doing to get the second phase of this was for ISNI, folks at OCLC, to start harvesting the ORCIDs and posting into their records.
So right now you don't have the full round trip.
No. So we have the comes to ORCID, we can harvest there. And it really means the researcher has to be on top of things. But just like with Scopus Author ID, most researchers have no idea if they have an ISNI. And so they see the ISNI to ORCID link, they're like, I'm not going to engage because they have no idea what it is. So part of, in talking with the OCLC rep on our board, I'm like, what are you guys going to do with ORCID? He's like, well, so what they're doing is waiting for the ORCID IDs to come in on the papers that they index, and then they'll push that into the VIA file and make it available that way. So they're, I think, looking at it more as a from now forward and not so much as a from here back. All of that, I mean, can change. It depends on what folks want to do. We do have a collaborative project with ISNI right now with La Trobe University in Australia, where La Trobe has worked with ISNI on creating ISNI records for all their faculty, pre-populating all that information, and then La Trobe said, you know, but we want ORCID IDs for all our people too. And you're like, okay. So now they're going and taking the next step to say, how can we get the researchers to link, to kind of set up that ORCID record through that same process and then link it to that ISNI authority file. So there's all kinds of ways of making this work. And
have you talked at all with anybody at NACO, the NAF, National Authority File?
Yeah, and so what we've been doing is interacting with the folks at ISNI and OCLC and hoping that that works. We don't want to, you have to be friendly. And so I don't want to start having ISNI or folks think that we're trying to get around them at all. And so it's really, we work with ISNI and through them to some of these other organizations. Yeah. I think you had a question, and we'll come back. In the back?
It might have already been answered, but I was curious about your mention of ORCID in connection with evaluation. So I was wondering, do they do some of these faculty activity reporting systems that we all have, speaking of retyping stuff in, we all type stuff in.
Yeah.
Are they like linking to ORCID now?
Oh, yes, they're starting. And so Academic Analytics is one that just joined ORCID and is working on moving information. The three big ones, there's Elsevier has a product, Thomson Reuters has a product, and Digital Science has a product, and all three of them work with ORCID and allow you to push, some already do, and some are working towards allowing folks to push pull information between the two systems, between ORCID and them, keep updating. So yes, the answer is yes. Now in terms of how that actually informs and may change the way that evaluation is carried out, the kinds of metrics that are used for evaluation is a big hope of mine. So yes, but it's starting. Yep.
So I was wondering, this is actually a little bit related in that a long time ago when I looked at ORCID, one of the things that they've been talking about doing was making ORCID the way that you authenticate for all these different systems. So for funding agencies, for signing into manuscripts.
Oh, that was a while ago.
And things like that.
Yes.
At the time, I was like, well, what a wonderful thing, because everybody hates all the million passwords that they have and all the different systems that they have to enter the same information into over and over again. Like the Science CV, being able to pull in things from ORCID, I think is probably one of the best ways for me to advertise ORCID going forward. Yeah. But the authentication part too was really appealing, and I was wondering if that was still like happening, or if there was a
Right. So there's two ways of looking at this, right? One is single sign-on, yay. But single sign-on, you have to be really careful about the kinds of security that's involved with the systems you're signing into. And then you have to be really careful about, if ORCID is suddenly this Uber sign-in thing, then ORCID suddenly becomes a target for hackers. And ORCID, you sign in with your name and your email address. Right? And so what we tell people is, look, we do have single sign-on enabled. You can use our APIs now to enable single sign-on with ORCID as your login. And some of the manuscript systems are doing that already. So you can come in, and if the journal uses the same platform, this journal, that form, you can use your single sign-on to get on using ORCID. Okay? But that, maybe not as big of a security risk as logging into a university. Yeah, I couldn't even get onto your wireless today. So the other piece is, ORCID can work with identity providers to be part of a shibboleth login process. Okay, so we're not actually the identity provider, but we can be used as what's called an attribute that allows login. Okay, so for example, when somebody logs into their university system, they can pair that login with their ORCID ID and ORCID credentials. So when somebody's already logged into the university, that means they're already logged into ORCID. Okay, so that's the way we're trying to handle this. So for those systems that are more secure, that have more issues, if somebody breaks in, that should be the preferred login method, but we pair ORCID with it. And so that's something we're working on right now, and we hope to be able to launch. We have to sign a service provider agreement, and we're going through legal on that. We hope to be able to launch that the first half of this year. Okay, so it is still on our list of things to do, but not quite in the same way that I think that was pre me joining the organization, that vision. And it was like, no, we can't do that. It's a bad idea. So anyway, yeah.
I'm going to stop this now so that we can very formally thank you and appreciate your time, your questions, your advice, your answers to our questions. And then invite all of you to stay to have some lunch with us and to continue to chat for as long as Laurel can stay with us.